What if everything you have ever achieved, every success you have celebrated, every disaster you have survived, was never truly yours to claim? What if there existed a force so ancient and so absolute that even the gods of Olympus feared her judgment? Tonight we descend into the mythology of the most terrifying deity the Greeks ever conceived, a goddess who could elevate a beggar to a throne before breakfast and destroy an empire before sunset, and whose invisible hand still shapes your life at this very moment, whether you believe in her or not. Her name is Tyche, and by the end of this story, you will never look at your own fortune the same way again. To understand Tyche, you must first understand the world that created her. The ancient Greeks did not merely worship gods. They built an entire civilization on the radical premise that the invisible forces governing human destiny could be given names, faces, and stories that revealed their true nature. Every river had its god. Every forest had its nymphs. Every emotion, from love to rage to grief, possessed a divine patron whose mythology encoded centuries of accumulated wisdom about the human condition. But among all these divine personifications, none proved more unsettling or more necessary than the goddess who embodied the one truth that every mortal instinctively recognized but desperately wished to deny, that the line between triumph and catastrophe was thinner than a spider's thread, and that no amount of virtue, intelligence, or preparation could guarantee which side of that line you would find yourself on when morning came. The genealogy of Tyche reveals the cosmic significance that the Greeks assigned to fortune's power. She was not some minor spirit haunting crossroads and marketplaces. According to Hesiod, whose theogony provided the authoritative account of divine origins, Tyche was born from Oceanus and Tethys, the primordial Titans whose union produced the 3,000 river goddesses known as the Oceanids. This parentage placed Tyche among the oldest divine beings in existence, older than Zeus himself, older than the Olympian order that most mortals regarded as the supreme expression of divine authority. Her mother Tethys embodied the nurturing flow of fresh water that sustained all terrestrial life, while her father Oceanus represented the vast encircling river that bounded the known world, a force of such magnitude that even the gods treated it with cautious respect. This oceanic heritage was no accident of mythological genealogy. The Greeks understood that water represented the most perfect natural metaphor for fortune's essential nature. A river could sustain a city or destroy it. The sea could carry merchants to unimaginable wealth, or swallow them without trace. Water was simultaneously the source of life and the instrument of death, nurturing and destructive, predictable in its general patterns, and catastrophically unpredictable in its specific manifestations. Tyche inherited all of these qualities from her aquatic parentage, embodying a force that was as necessary to human existence as water itself, and equally capable of transforming from gentle sustenance to overwhelming destruction without warning or apparent cause. But Pindar, the great lyric poet whose victory odes celebrated the achievements of athletic champions throughout the Greek world, offered an alternative genealogy that elevated Tyche's status even further. In his 12th Olympian ode, Pindar identified Tyche as a daughter of Zeus himself, the king of the gods whose authority governed the cosmic order. This alternative parentage transformed Tyche from an ancient elemental force into a direct expression of supreme divine will, suggesting that fortune's apparently random interventions in human affairs actually reflected the deliberate purposes of the highest divine authority. If Tyche was Zeus's daughter, then her gifts and punishments carried the weight of cosmic justice, even when mortal observers could not perceive the principles that governed their distribution. The tension between these two genealogies, one placing Tyche among the primordial forces that preceded the Olympian order, and the other making her a direct agent of Olympian authority, reflected a genuine philosophical disagreement about the nature of fortune that the Greeks never fully resolved. Was chance a fundamental feature of reality that existed independently of divine will, or was it an instrument through which divine purposes were accomplished in ways that exceeded mortal comprehension? This question, first posed in mythological terms more than 25 centuries ago, continues to generate debate among philosophers, theologians, and scientists who struggle with the same fundamental uncertainty about the relationship between randomness and purpose that the Greeks encoded in Tyche's contradictory origins. The symbols that the Greeks assigned to Tyche constituted a visual language of extraordinary sophistication that communicated complex theological concepts through images that even illiterate worshippers could immediately comprehend. The most famous of these symbols, the great wheel upon which the goddess was frequently depicted standing or seated, expressed the cyclical nature of fortune with an elegance that no verbal description could match. The wheel turned continuously, elevating those at the bottom while simultaneously casting down those who had reached the top, and its motion could neither be stopped nor predicted by those whose fates depended on its rotation. The psychological impact of this image derived from its implication that prosperity and adversity were not permanent states but temporary positions on a cycle that guaranteed eventual reversal. The king who sat at the wheel's apex could see the ground rushing up to meet those who had preceded him, while the beggar at the bottom could observe the upward trajectory that awaited those who maintained their grip during the lowest point of the rotation. This visual metaphor communicated a message that was simultaneously terrifying and consoling. Terrifying because it denied the possibility of permanent security, and consoling because it promised that even the most devastating misfortune was temporary. The cornucopia, the horn of plenty that overflowed with fruits, grains, and flowers, represented Tyche's capacity to bestow material abundance with a generosity that could transform individual lives and entire communities overnight. But the horn's association with the goddess carried an implicit warning that her gifts were not guaranteed to continue and might be withdrawn as suddenly as they had been granted. The abundance that poured from the cornucopia was not a permanent endowment, but a temporary loan, whose terms could change without notice, and those who treated fortune's gifts as permanent possessions rather than temporary trusts demonstrated the kind of presumption that typically preceded the goddess's most dramatic reversals. The rudder that Tyche held in many artistic representations symbolized her role as the navigator of human destiny, the divine helmsman who steered mortal lives through waters whose currents and hazards exceeded human capacity to predict or control. This nautical imagery resonated powerfully with a civilization whose prosperity depended on maritime commerce, and whose daily experience confirmed that the sea rewarded careful preparation while remaining ultimately indifferent to human desires and expectations. The rudder suggested that Tyche did not merely distribute fortune randomly, but actively directed the course of human events, according to purposes that mortals could sense but never fully comprehend. Perhaps the most psychologically revealing of Tyche's symbols was the blindfold that appeared in some artistic representations, suggesting that the goddess distributed her gifts and punishments without regard for the moral character, social status, or personal merit of those affected. This image challenged the deeply human desire to believe that the universe operated according to principles of justice that rewarded virtue and punished vice, suggesting instead that fortune's distribution followed criteria that bore no consistent relationship to the qualities that mortals valued most highly. The blindfolded goddess gave wealth to fools and poverty to sages, health to the wicked and disease to the righteous, success to the lazy and failure to the diligent, with an impartiality that seemed to mock every human attempt to establish a moral order that could guarantee appropriate outcomes. The worship of Tyche did not emerge from abstract theological speculation, but from the brutal practical experiences of communities whose survival depended on activities that placed them at the mercy of forces they could neither predict nor control. The maritime cities of the Aegean, whose economies revolved around seaborne commerce that connected the Greek world with the civilizations of Egypt, Phoenicia, and the Black Sea coast, developed the earliest and most elaborate Tyche cults because their daily experience confirmed the goddess's power with a vividness that inland agricultural communities could not match. Consider the reality of ancient maritime commerce. A merchant who invested his entire fortune in a cargo of olive oil, wine, or pottery committed his family's future to a wooden vessel that would spend weeks or months navigating waters where storms could appear without warning, where pirates operated with near impunity in the countless islands and hidden coves of the Aegean, and where the political situations at destination ports could change dramatically during the time required for a voyage. The merchant who dispatched his ship in favorable conditions might receive news weeks later that his vessel had been lost with all hands in a storm that struck without warning, or that pirates had captured his cargo and sold his crew into slavery, or that a war had broken out at his intended destination that made commercial activity impossible. The psychological burden of this uncertainty produced a distinctive form of religious consciousness that distinguished maritime communities from their inland counterparts. Farmers faced their own uncertainties: drought, flood, pestilence, but agricultural risks followed seasonal patterns that enabled some degree of prediction and preparation. Maritime risks, by contrast, could materialize at any moment and from any direction, creating a permanent state of anxiety that required theological frameworks capable of acknowledging and accommodating radical unpredictability. Tyche's worship provided exactly this framework, offering not the false comfort of guaranteed divine protection, but the more honest acknowledgement that fortune's distribution followed principles that exceeded mortal comprehension. The port city of Smyrna developed one of the ancient world's most elaborate Tyche cults, constructing a magnificent temple that served as both a religious center and a practical institution where merchants sought divine guidance before undertaking commercial ventures. The temple's priests developed sophisticated rituals for consulting the goddess about the advisability of specific voyages, the likely conditions at particular destinations, and the appropriate offerings that might secure divine favor for commercial enterprises. These consultations combined genuine religious devotion with practical intelligence gathering, as the temple's network of contacts throughout the Mediterranean provided information about weather patterns, political conditions, and market opportunities that supplemented the divine guidance obtained through ritual procedures. The relationship between Tyche worship and commercial activity produced a distinctive ethical framework that influenced business practices throughout the Greek world. Merchants who attributed their success to divine favor rather than personal merit were more likely to share their prosperity through charitable activities and public benefactions that acknowledged their debt to the goddess and maintained the community relationships that provided insurance against future reversals. This ethic of reciprocal generosity, rooted in theological convictions about fortune's nature, created social safety nets that protected communities against the economic disruptions that individual commercial failures could produce. The most revealing aspect of Tyche's worship in commercial contexts was the practice of dedicating a portion of profits to the goddess before calculating personal gains, a custom that reflected the theological conviction that fortune's gifts remained divine property even after they had been transferred to mortal hands. This practice, which modern observers might interpret as a form of insurance premium paid to a divine underwriter, expressed a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual prosperity and cosmic forces that contemporary economic theory has only recently begun to acknowledge through concepts like systemic risk and black swan events. But Tyche's influence extended far beyond the commercial sphere, to encompass every aspect of Greek life, where outcomes depended on factors that exceeded individual control. Athletic competitions, which occupied a central position in Greek cultural life, and provided opportunities for individuals and cities to demonstrate their excellence before audiences drawn from throughout the Greek world, were understood as arenas where Tyche's influence could prove decisive, regardless of the athlete's physical preparation and competitive determination. The Olympic Games, the most prestigious athletic competition in the ancient world, provided regular demonstrations of fortune's power to override human preparation and expectation. Athletes who had trained for years under the guidance of expert coaches and who possessed physical capabilities that seemed to guarantee victory could be defeated by opponents whose inferior preparation was compensated by favorable circumstances that no amount of training could have produced. A stumble at a critical moment, a gust of wind that affected the trajectory of a discus throw, a muscle cramp that struck at precisely the wrong instant. These apparently minor events could determine the outcome of competitions that carried enormous consequences for the athletes involved and the communities they represented. Pindar's victory odes, which celebrated the achievements of Olympic and other athletic champions, consistently acknowledged Tyche's role in determining competitive outcomes, even as they praised the personal qualities of the victors whose achievements they commemorated. The poet understood that athletic victory required a combination of natural talent, disciplined training, competitive determination, and divine favor, and that the absence of any one of these elements could prevent even the most gifted athlete from achieving the success that his abilities seemed to warrant. This recognition of fortune's influence did not diminish the glory of athletic achievement, but placed it within a cosmic context that enhanced its significance by connecting individual excellence with divine purposes that transcended personal ambition. The political dimensions of Tyche's influence proved equally significant in a civilization where democratic institutions placed enormous power in the hands of citizen assemblies whose decisions could be influenced by factors ranging from the weather on voting day to the rhetorical skill of speakers whose arguments might or might not reflect the actual merits of the policies they advocated. Athenian democracy, the most developed form of popular government in the ancient world, operated through mechanisms that explicitly acknowledged the role of chance in political processes, most notably through the use of sortition, the selection of public officials by lottery rather than election. The Athenian practice of selecting most public officials by lot reflected a theological conviction that Tyche's involvement in the selection process would produce outcomes superior to those that human judgment alone could achieve. This seemingly paradoxical belief rested on the observation that electoral processes were vulnerable to manipulation by wealthy and rhetorically skilled individuals whose personal interests might not align with the common good, while random selection eliminated these sources of corruption by removing human agency from the selection process entirely. The lottery system effectively delegated the choice of public officials to Tyche herself, trusting that the goddess's selections would prove at least as beneficial as those produced by the flawed human judgment that electoral processes relied upon. The stories that the Greeks told about Tyche's interventions in the lives of specific individuals constitute some of the most psychologically penetrating narratives in world literature, encoding centuries of accumulated wisdom about the relationship between fortune and character in dramatic forms that continue to resonate with audiences separated from their original context by more than 2 millennia. These narratives were not mere entertainment, but served as vehicles for transmitting essential knowledge about the nature of existence that could not be adequately communicated through abstract philosophical argument alone. The story of Croesus, king of Lydia, provided the archetypal narrative of fortune's reversal that would influence Greek thought for centuries and establish patterns of storytelling that continue to shape contemporary understanding of the relationship between wealth and wisdom. Croesus ruled a kingdom whose natural resources, particularly the gold-bearing rivers that flowed through Lydian territory, had generated wealth so vast that his name became synonymous with unlimited riches in a proverbial expression that survives in modern languages more than 25 centuries after his reign. His court attracted visitors from throughout the Mediterranean world, who came to marvel at displays of wealth that exceeded anything they had previously imagined, and his reputation for generosity ensured that poets, philosophers, and artists competed for his patronage. The encounter between Croesus and Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, whose reputation for wisdom matched the Lydian king's reputation for wealth, produced one of the most famous dialogues in ancient literature and established the philosophical framework within which all subsequent Greek thinking about fortune would operate. When Croesus, eager to receive confirmation of what he regarded as self-evident truth, asked Solon to identify the happiest person the wise man had encountered in his extensive travels, he expected to hear his own name spoken with the reverence that his extraordinary prosperity seemed to warrant. Solon's response shattered this expectation with a directness that bordered on diplomatic recklessness. He named Tellus of Athens, an obscure citizen who had lived to see his children and grandchildren prosper, who had served his city with distinction in battle, and who had died fighting heroically in defense of his community. When the astonished Croesus pressed for a second choice, Solon named Cleobus and Beton, two young men from Argos whose devotion to their mother had been rewarded by the gods with a peaceful death that spared them the suffering that extended life inevitably brought. The philosophical principle that Solon articulated in explaining these choices, that no person could be called truly happy until their life had ended, because fortune's wheel might turn at any moment to transform prosperity into disaster, represented one of the most profound insights that ancient Greek culture produced. This principle acknowledged that human happiness depended not on the accumulation of wealth or the achievement of power, but on the overall trajectory of a life that could only be evaluated after its completion. The richest king in the world might end his days in misery, while the obscure citizen, who lived modestly and died well, might achieve a happiness that no amount of wealth could guarantee. Croesus dismissed Solon's wisdom with the contempt that the prosperous typically reserve for warnings about fortune's instability, and the Athenian departed from the Lydian court without the honors that he might have received had he provided the flattering response that his host expected. But the events that followed demonstrated Tyche's characteristic precision in arranging circumstances that would validate the wisdom that Croesus had rejected. The king's beloved son Tethys, whose youth and promise seemed to guarantee the continuation of Lydian prosperity into the next generation, was killed in a hunting accident that transformed Croesus's paternal pride into inconsolable grief. This personal tragedy, devastating in itself, proved to be merely the prelude to a political catastrophe that would destroy everything the king had built. Emboldened by an ambiguous oracle from Delphi that promised he would destroy a great empire if he attacked Persia, Croesus launched a military campaign against Cyrus the Great that ended in the complete destruction of the Lydian kingdom and the capture of its king. The great empire that the oracle had promised Croesus would destroy proved to be his own, a cruel demonstration of Tyche's fondness for arranging circumstances that fulfilled divine promises in ways that mortals could not anticipate. Standing on the funeral pyre that Cyrus had ordered constructed for his execution, Croesus finally understood the wisdom that Solon had offered, and that he had so arrogantly dismissed. His cry of "Solon, Solon, Solon," echoed across the flames as the recognition of his own folly merged with the physical agony of his impending death. The story of Polycrates of Samos provided an equally compelling demonstration of fortune's resistance to human attempts at manipulation and control. Polycrates had achieved a level of success that seemed to exceed what any mortal could reasonably expect, building a naval empire that dominated the eastern Aegean and accumulating wealth that rivaled the treasuries of established kingdoms. His unbroken record of success in military, commercial, and diplomatic ventures created a reputation for invincibility that attracted allies and intimidated potential opponents. But it also generated the kind of anxiety that the Greeks associated with excessive divine favor. Amasis, the pharaoh of Egypt and Polycrates' ally, recognized the danger inherent in the tyrant's uninterrupted prosperity and sent a warning that expressed one of the most sophisticated theological insights in ancient literature. Amasis observed that the gods were jealous of excessive human success, and that a person who experienced nothing but good fortune was being set up for a catastrophic reversal that would be proportional to the prosperity that preceded it. He advised Polycrates to voluntarily sacrifice his most precious possession as a preemptive offering that might appease divine jealousy and avert the catastrophic reversal that unbroken success inevitably attracted. Polycrates took this advice seriously enough to cast his most treasured possession, a magnificent emerald ring set in gold, into the sea as a sacrifice to the gods. But within days, a fisherman presented the tyrant with a magnificent fish, and when the fish was cut open for preparation, the ring was discovered in its belly. The sea itself had refused to accept Polycrates' sacrifice, returning his offering with a message that could not have been clearer. The reversal that fortune had planned for him could not be averted through voluntary sacrifice, no matter how valuable the offering. When Amasis learned of the ring's return, he immediately severed his alliance with Polycrates, recognizing that association with a man whom the gods had marked for destruction would bring catastrophe upon anyone connected with him. This diplomatic abandonment proved prophetic when Polycrates was lured to the mainland by the Persian satrap Oroetes with promises of shared wealth and political alliance, only to be captured, tortured, and crucified in a manner so degrading that ancient sources struggle to describe it without expressing horror at the contrast between his former glory and his ultimate fate. The story of King Midas added another dimension to the Greek understanding of Tyche's nature by demonstrating that the goddess's gifts could prove more destructive than her punishments. When Dionysus offered Midas any wish as a reward for his hospitality to the god's companion Silenus, the king requested that everything he touched be transformed into gold. This wish, which seemed to represent the ultimate triumph over fortune's uncertainty by guaranteeing unlimited wealth regardless of external circumstances, proved to be a curse of devastating precision. The food that turned to gold in his mouth, the water that solidified before he could drink, and the beloved daughter whose warm flesh transformed into cold metal beneath his embrace, demonstrated that fortune's gifts, when divorced from the wisdom necessary to use them properly, could destroy everything that made life worth living. The story of Gyges of Lydia introduced yet another dimension to the Greek understanding of fortune's operations, demonstrating how Tyche could use the discovery of hidden power to test moral character in ways that revealed the true nature of individuals who had previously been constrained by circumstances rather than conviction. Gyges was a shepherd in the service of King Candace of Lydia, an ordinary man whose life would have passed without historical notice had fortune not intervened to place extraordinary power in his hands through a sequence of events so improbable that they could only be attributed to divine orchestration. According to the version preserved by Plato in the Republic, Gyges discovered a magical ring in an underground chamber revealed by an earthquake, a ring that granted its wearer the power of invisibility. This discovery transformed an ordinary shepherd into a figure of unlimited potential, as the ability to act without observation or consequence removed every external constraint on behavior that social life normally imposed. The ring did not change Gyges' character but revealed it, stripping away the social pressures that had previously enforced conformity to moral standards and exposing the desires and ambitions that had been concealed beneath the surface of ordinary behavior. What Gyges chose to do with his newfound power, seducing the queen, murdering the king, and seizing the throne of Lydia, demonstrated the philosophical point that Plato used the story to illustrate, that most human virtue was a product of external constraint rather than internal conviction, and that the removal of consequences would reveal the true moral character that social pressure normally concealed. But the story also carried implications for understanding Tyche's nature that extended beyond Plato's philosophical purposes, suggesting that fortune's gifts served as tests of character, whose outcomes revealed truths about human nature that comfortable circumstances could never expose. The dynasty that Gyges founded through his fortune-assisted crimes endured for 5 generations before culminating in the reign of Croesus, whose story we have already examined. This genealogical connection between Gyges' morally compromised acquisition of power and Croesus's catastrophic loss of it suggested that Tyche's accounting operated across generational timescales that exceeded individual human lifetimes. The fortune that elevated Gyges from shepherd to king carried a debt that would not come due for more than a century, but when the payment was finally demanded, it consumed not only the wealth and power that Gyges had seized, but the entire kingdom that his descendants had built upon his original crime. The Greek concept of inherited fortune, the idea that the consequences of one generation's relationship with Tyche could affect the prosperity and adversity experienced by subsequent generations, added a temporal dimension to the understanding of fortune that distinguished Greek theological thought from simpler models that limited fortune's influence to individual lifetimes. This concept reflected the observation that families and dynasties experienced patterns of prosperity and decline that seemed to follow trajectories established by the actions of their founders, as if the moral quality of the original acquisition of wealth or power determined the long-term stability of the fortune that resulted. The Athenian tyrant Pisistratus provided another illustration of fortune's complex relationship with political power, demonstrating how Tyche could favor individuals whose methods violated conventional moral standards while punishing others whose behavior seemed to warrant divine approval. Pisistratus seized power in Athens through a combination of military force, political manipulation, and theatrical deception that included a famous incident in which he staged a fake assassination attempt to justify the creation of a personal bodyguard that he subsequently used to occupy the Acropolis and establish tyrannical rule. Despite the morally questionable methods through which he acquired power, Pisistratus proved to be one of the most effective and popular rulers in Athenian history, implementing economic reforms that benefited ordinary citizens, sponsoring cultural programs that enhanced Athens' reputation throughout the Greek world, and maintaining peaceful relations with neighboring states that enabled commercial prosperity. His reign seemed to demonstrate that Tyche's favor could be directed toward individuals whose political methods violated conventional moral standards, provided that the outcomes of their rule served the broader interests of the communities they governed. However, the fortune that sustained Pisistratus's rule did not extend with equal generosity to his successors, whose attempts to maintain the tyranny their father had established provoked the resistance that eventually led to the establishment of Athenian democracy. The assassination of Hipparchus by Harmodius and Aristogeiton and the subsequent expulsion of Hippias by a combination of Athenian resistance and Spartan military intervention demonstrated that the fortune which had favored the founder of a dynasty could be withdrawn from his heirs with devastating consequences. The merchant Hipponicus of Athens provided a more intimate illustration of fortune's operations in the commercial sphere, demonstrating how Tyche could destroy even the most carefully constructed business enterprises through the convergence of apparently unrelated events whose combined impact exceeded anything that prudent planning could have anticipated. Hipponicus had built one of the largest commercial fortunes in 5th century Athens through decades of shrewd trading, careful risk management, and strategic cultivation of political connections that provided protection against the competitive pressures that destroyed less well-connected rivals. At the height of his prosperity, Hipponicus committed the fatal error that Tyche's mythology consistently identified as the trigger for catastrophic reversal. He publicly boasted that his intelligence and business acumen had rendered him immune to the misfortunes that afflicted lesser men. At a symposium celebrating a particularly profitable trading expedition, the merchant declared that he had conquered fortune itself, challenging anyone present to identify a single venture he had undertaken that had failed to produce substantial profits. The reversal that followed demonstrated Tyche's precision. Within months, a storm sank 12 vessels carrying a season's grain purchases. A second fleet was seized by pirates. Creditors who had extended generous terms suddenly demanded immediate repayment. Property values collapsed as he attempted to liquidate assets. Political allies distanced themselves. Accounting irregularities concealed during prosperity became visible during contraction. The merchant who had boasted of conquering fortune found himself facing criminal prosecution in the very courts where he had previously appeared as a respected citizen. The psychological devastation proved as complete as the material destruction. Hipponicus's understanding of the world, which attributed success to personal merit and failure to personal inadequacy, provided no framework for processing experiences that contradicted everything he had believed. The story became a standard cautionary tale in Athenian commercial circles, reinforcing religious piety, encouraging commercial humility, and providing psychological comfort to those who had experienced business failures by suggesting that their misfortunes resulted from divine intervention rather than personal inadequacy. The philosophical responses to Tyche's challenge produced some of the most sophisticated thinking about chance, probability, and human agency that the ancient world would generate. Greek thinkers recognized that the goddess's apparent capriciousness might conceal systematic patterns that careful analysis could identify, even if the specific timing of her interventions remained unpredictable. Thales of Miletus demonstrated through both his achievements and his personal experiences the complex relationship between wisdom and fortune. His prediction of a solar eclipse established his reputation as a thinker of extraordinary insight, suggesting that careful observation could penetrate the apparent randomness of natural events. This implied that Tyche's domain might be smaller than popular belief suggested. However, the equally famous story of Thales falling into a well while observing the stars provided a counterpoint that demonstrated the limitations of intellectual achievement in protecting against mundane hazards. The philosopher who could predict celestial events proved unable to navigate a familiar path without stumbling into an obstacle that any ordinary person would have avoided. The Thracian servant girl who laughed at Thales' predicament articulated a perspective that philosophers would debate for centuries. Her observation that the philosopher who claimed to understand the heavens could not see what was beneath his feet challenged the assumption that intellectual achievement conferred practical advantages in navigating daily uncertainties. Democritus proposed that what mortals perceived as divine intervention was actually the result of natural processes operating according to mechanical principles that produced outcomes appearing random only because their causes were too complex for human minds to trace. His atomic theory provided a physical mechanism for understanding how apparently random events could emerge from deterministic processes, anticipating modern concepts of chaos and complexity by more than 2 millennia. Fortune, in this interpretation, was not a goddess who made conscious decisions, but a name that mortals gave to the gap between their limited understanding and the actual complexity of causal processes. Socrates argued that the moral dimensions of fortune's distribution, the tendency for hubris to precede downfall and for virtue to receive eventual reward, suggested purposeful design rather than random mechanical interaction. Plato acknowledged fortune's influence while arguing that the philosopher who understood the forms possessed an inner stability that rendered external circumstances relatively insignificant. The just person who suffered misfortune remained fundamentally better off than the unjust person who prospered, because true well-being depended on the condition of the soul rather than material circumstances. Aristotle's more empirically grounded approach acknowledged that external goods contributed to human flourishing in ways that could not be dismissed by appeals to inner virtue. A person who possessed all moral virtues but lacked the material resources to exercise them could not achieve complete flourishing, suggesting that Tyche's influence on external goods had genuine implications for well-being. However, he also recognized that possessing material goods without the moral character to use them properly could impede rather than promote authentic flourishing. The Stoics developed the most radical response, arguing that external circumstances were entirely irrelevant to genuine well-being. Zeno taught that virtue alone was sufficient for happiness, and that all external events were morally indifferent. The concept of apatheia, freedom from emotional disturbance caused by external events, represented a direct challenge to Tyche's traditional role. If the wise person could maintain complete equanimity regardless of circumstances, then the goddess's interventions lost their capacity to reveal character or demonstrate the instability of human achievements. The Epicureans offered a different challenge, arguing that the gods existed but did not intervene in human affairs. Epicurus taught that fear of the gods and anxiety about fortune's unpredictability were primary sources of human unhappiness, and that philosophical understanding could liberate mortals from these unnecessary sources of distress. The wise Epicurean could enjoy prosperity without anxiety about its loss and endure adversity without the additional suffering caused by belief that a divine agent had deliberately chosen to inflict misfortune. These philosophical schools, despite their disagreements, shared a common recognition that Tyche's challenge required a response that went beyond mere theological acceptance or ritual propitiation. Each school attempted to develop practical strategies for maintaining psychological equilibrium and moral purpose in a world where outcomes could not be guaranteed, and each contributed insights that continue to influence contemporary approaches to the same fundamental challenge. The transformation of Tyche from a Greek goddess into a universal principle that transcended cultural boundaries accelerated dramatically during the Hellenistic era, when Alexander the Great's conquests created a vast multicultural empire where Greek religious concepts encountered the theological traditions of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and beyond. Alexander himself served as one of the most dramatic examples of Tyche's influence. His meteoric rise from the young king of a relatively minor Macedonian kingdom to ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen seemed to require supernatural explanation. The speed and completeness of his conquests, achieved against opponents with vastly superior resources, suggested that some extraordinary divine force was actively arranging circumstances that guaranteed success regardless of the objective balance of power. The Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC provided the most striking example. Darius III had assembled an army outnumbering Alexander's forces by ratios of 3 to 5 to 1, occupying a battlefield specifically prepared to maximize Persian advantages. Every rational calculation suggested the Persians should overwhelm the smaller Macedonian force. Yet a gap that opened in the Persian line at precisely the moment Alexander's cavalry was positioned to exploit it. Darius's decision to flee before the engagement was decided, dust clouds that obscured visibility at critical moments, all bore the hallmarks of Tyche's intervention. These factors individually might have been attributed to chance, but their convergence at a single engagement consistently favoring one side suggested divine assistance. Alexander's relationship with Tyche grew increasingly complex as his behavior began exhibiting the signs of hubris that traditionally preceded dramatic reversals. The young king, who had initially attributed his successes to divine favor, gradually began claiming divine status for himself, demanding proskynesis and encouraging a personal cult. This progression from grateful acknowledgement to personal claims of divinity represented exactly the hubris that Tyche traditionally punished. His death at 32, just as his empire reached its maximum extent, bore all the hallmarks of Tyche's characteristic timing. The fever that struck him in Babylon arrived precisely when his ambitions had expanded to encompass new campaigns that would have carried his armies to the western Mediterranean. The goddess had allowed him to achieve everything necessary to demonstrate both the extraordinary heights fortune could elevate a mortal and the absolute finality with which she could terminate even the most spectacular career. The fragmentation of his empire after death provided an even more dramatic demonstration of Tyche's power than his conquests had. The vast territories he had unified dissolved into competing kingdoms within a single generation. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged developed sophisticated Tyche cults reflecting their rulers' acute awareness of fortune's role in political survival. The city of Antioch developed the most famous representation of municipal Tyche. The sculptor Eutychides created a bronze statue depicting the goddess seated on a rock representing Mount Silpius, wearing a mural crown symbolizing the city's walls, her foot resting on a swimming figure representing the Orontes River. This masterpiece established an iconographic model replicated throughout the ancient world. As other cities commissioned similar representations adapted to their local characteristics. The spread of Tyche worship reflected broader cultural changes that made fortune's unpredictability increasingly relevant to populations experiencing rapid transformation. The collapse of the traditional city-state system created widespread anxiety that traditional religious practices could not address. Tyche's appeal derived precisely from her acknowledgement that the future was genuinely unpredictable, and that no amount of conventional wisdom could guarantee security in a world where entire kingdoms could be created or destroyed within a single generation. The syncretistic tendencies of Hellenistic religion facilitated Tyche's identification with fortune deities from other traditions. In Egypt, she merged with Isis in her aspect as goddess of fate, combining Greek philosophical sophistication with Egyptian ritual intensity. In the East, identification with Ishtar created a composite deity whose influence encompassed virtually every aspect of human experience. The Roman encounter with Tyche produced one of the most significant cultural transformations in the goddess's history. The identification of Tyche with the Roman goddess Fortuna created a syncretic deity combining Greek philosophical depth with Roman practical orientation. The early Roman Fortuna had been primarily associated with agricultural fertility and household prosperity, lacking the cosmic scope of the Greek Tyche. The encounter with Greek thought transformed her into a major figure whose influence encompassed every aspect of public and private life, Roman artists adapted Tyche's iconography to emphasize aspects most relevant to political and military concerns. The cornucopia appeared in contexts emphasizing state rather than individual wealth. The wheel acquired political significance, symbolizing the rise and fall of careers in the competitive environment of republican and imperial politics. The rudder became a symbol of imperial governance, with emperors associating themselves with Fortuna's steering to legitimize their authority by connecting it with cosmic forces. The Temple of Fortuna at Praeneste, one of the most magnificent religious complexes in the ancient world, demonstrated the scale of Roman investment in fortune worship. This vast architectural ensemble, built into the hillside in a series of terraces connected by ramps and staircases, combined religious functions with oracular consultation that attracted visitors from throughout the Mediterranean. The temple's oracle, which operated through a system of lots drawn from a sacred well, provided guidance on questions ranging from military strategy to commercial ventures, reflecting the comprehensive scope of Fortuna's influence in Roman understanding. Roman generals developed elaborate rituals for securing Fortuna's favor before military campaigns, recognizing that the outcome of battles depended on factors that exceeded the control of even the most skilled commanders. The practice of consulting auguries, examining the entrails of sacrificial animals, and performing purification rituals before engaging the enemy, reflected the conviction that military success required divine cooperation that could not be guaranteed through human preparation alone. Generals who neglected these rituals, or who displayed excessive confidence in their own abilities, were regarded as reckless, not merely in military terms, but in theological terms, as their behavior demonstrated the kind of hubris that Fortuna traditionally punished. The political culture of the late Republic provided dramatic illustrations of Fortuna's influence on individual careers that echoed the patterns established in Greek mythology. The rise and fall of figures like Pompey the Great, whose extraordinary military successes earned him the title Magnus before his catastrophic defeat at Pharsalus and his ignominious death in Egypt, demonstrated the same dynamics of fortune's reversal that the stories of Croesus and Polycrates had illustrated centuries earlier. Pompey's career trajectory, from triumphant general to desperate fugitive within the space of a single campaign, confirmed the ancient wisdom that military glory was among the most unstable of fortune's gifts. Julius Caesar's relationship with Fortuna became one of the most discussed examples of divine favor in Roman history. His famous declaration, "The die is cast," as he crossed the Rubicon, expressed a willingness to commit his fate to fortune's judgment that combined personal courage with theological awareness. Caesar's consistent success in situations where rational calculation suggested he should fail, his escape from pirates, his victories against numerically superior opponents, his survival of political conspiracies, created a reputation for divine favor that enhanced his political authority. Yet his assassination on the Ides of March demonstrated that even Fortuna's most favored recipients remained vulnerable to the sudden reversals that the goddess's mythology consistently predicted. Augustus, who emerged from the chaos of the civil wars to establish the Roman Empire, developed the most sophisticated political theology of fortune in the ancient world. He attributed his success not to personal merit alone, but to a combination of virtus and felicitas, personal excellence and divine favor, that acknowledged Fortuna's role, while claiming that his particular relationship with the goddess justified his unprecedented political authority. This theological framework proved enormously effective as a tool of political legitimation, as it suggested that opposition to Augustus's rule constituted not merely political rebellion, but resistance to divine will as expressed through Fortuna's favor. The enduring relevance of Tyche's mythology in contemporary culture reflects the fundamental human need to understand the role of chance in determining destiny. Despite enormous scientific advances, modern humans continue to experience the same bewildering combination of predictability and randomness that prompted Tyche's cult more than 25 centuries ago. Stock market crashes replace shipwrecks, viral pandemics replace divine plagues, but the underlying vulnerability to forces beyond individual control remains unchanged. Psychological research has confirmed many insights the ancient Greeks attributed to Tyche. The illusion of control, the tendency to believe one's actions influence outcomes actually determined by chance, echoes the ancient observation that mortals who enjoyed prolonged success attributed prosperity to personal merit rather than divine favor. The just world hypothesis, the tendency to believe people get what they deserve, reflects the same moral framework that Greek theologians struggle to reconcile with Tyche's random distribution of fortune. The concept of survivorship bias represents a modern formulation of ancient insights. This cognitive bias leads observers to focus on successful individuals while ignoring equally talented people who fail due to uncontrollable circumstances, producing exactly the hubris that ancient Greeks recognized as the precursor to Tyche's most dramatic interventions. Financial markets provide perhaps the most direct modern analog to the maritime commerce that first prompted Tyche's cult. Like ancient merchants who risked fortunes on sea voyages, modern investors commit resources to instruments whose values fluctuate according to factors no individual can fully comprehend. Watching carefully researched investments lose value, while poorly considered speculations generate enormous returns, echoes the ancient observation that fortune distributed gifts without regard for intelligence or diligence. Nassim Nicholas Taleb's Black Swan theory represents one of the most explicit modern engagements with Tyche's intellectual tradition, arguing that rare and unpredictable events have far greater impact than normal fluctuations that statistical models accommodate. His analysis echoes the ancient recognition that Tyche's most significant interventions involved precisely the extraordinary circumstances that conventional wisdom could not anticipate. The contemporary self-help industry, with its emphasis on personal empowerment and controlling destiny through positive thinking, represents a modern version of the hubris that ancient Greeks recognized as the most dangerous response to fortune's favor. The message that individuals can achieve any outcome through sufficient effort echoes the claims of ancient rulers who believed personal qualities rendered them immune to fortune's reversals. The global pandemic demonstrated fortune's continued power to override human planning, with events exceeding conventional risk assessment. Communities that had invested enormous resources in development discovered that a microscopic pathogen could render achievements temporarily irrelevant. The pandemic's disproportionate impact on different communities echoed the ancient observation that fortune distributed punishments according to criteria bearing no consistent relationship to moral character or practical preparation. The technological optimism that characterizes contemporary culture, with its faith in artificial intelligence and genetic engineering to eliminate uncertainty, represents the latest iteration of the ancient desire to transcend Tyche's influence through superior knowledge. Each generation has believed its advances would finally enable control over fortune, and each has discovered that new forms of unpredictability emerge to replace those conquered. Environmental challenges provide another context where Tyche's lessons retain relevance. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource depletion represent fortune reversals operating on scales that dwarf ancient catastrophes, but the underlying dynamic remains identical. Communities built on assumptions of stability discover that the systems they depend upon are subject to changes no amount of planning can fully anticipate. The enduring relevance of Tyche's mythology in contemporary culture reflects the fundamental human need to understand the role of chance in determining destiny. Despite enormous scientific advances, modern humans continue to experience the same bewildering combination of predictability and randomness that prompted Tyche's cult more than 25 centuries ago. Stock market crashes replace shipwrecks, viral pandemics replace divine plagues, but the underlying vulnerability to forces beyond individual control remains unchanged. Psychological research has confirmed many insights the ancient Greeks attributed to Tyche. The illusion of control, the tendency to believe one's actions influence outcomes actually determined by chance, echoes the ancient observation that mortals who enjoyed prolonged success attributed prosperity to personal merit rather than divine favor. The just world hypothesis, the tendency to believe people get what they deserve, reflects the same moral framework that Greek theologians struggle to reconcile with Tyche's random distribution of fortune. The concept of survivorship bias represents a modern formulation of ancient insights. This cognitive bias leads observers to focus on successful individuals while ignoring equally talented people who fail due to uncontrollable circumstances, producing exactly the hubris that ancient Greeks recognized as the precursor to Tyche's most dramatic interventions. Financial markets provide perhaps the most direct modern analog to the maritime commerce that first prompted Tyche's cult. Like ancient merchants who risked fortunes on sea voyages, modern investors commit resources to instruments whose values fluctuate according to factors no individual can fully comprehend. Watching carefully researched investments lose value, while poorly considered speculations generate enormous returns, echoes the ancient observation that fortune distributed gifts without regard for intelligence or diligence. Nassim Nicholas Taleb's Black Swan theory represents one of the most explicit modern engagements with Tyche's intellectual tradition, arguing that rare and unpredictable events have far greater impact than normal fluctuations that statistical models accommodate. His analysis echoes the ancient recognition that Tyche's most significant interventions involved precisely the extraordinary circumstances that conventional wisdom could not anticipate. The contemporary self-help industry, with its emphasis on personal empowerment and controlling destiny through positive thinking, represents a modern version of the hubris that ancient Greeks recognized as the most dangerous response to fortune's favor. The message that individuals can achieve any outcome through sufficient effort echoes the claims of ancient rulers who believed personal qualities rendered them immune to fortune's reversals. The global pandemic demonstrated fortune's continued power to override human planning, with events exceeding conventional risk assessment. Communities that had invested enormous resources in development discovered that a microscopic pathogen could render achievements temporarily irrelevant. The pandemic's disproportionate impact on different communities echoed the ancient observation that fortune distributed punishments according to criteria bearing no consistent relationship to moral character or practical preparation. The technological optimism that characterizes contemporary culture, with its faith in artificial intelligence and genetic engineering to eliminate uncertainty, represents the latest iteration of the ancient desire to transcend Tyche's influence through superior knowledge. Each generation has believed its advances would finally enable control over fortune, and each has discovered that new forms of unpredictability emerge to replace those conquered. Environmental challenges provide another context where Tyche's lessons retain relevance. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource depletion represent fortune reversals operating on scales that dwarf ancient catastrophes, but the underlying dynamic remains identical. Communities built on assumptions of stability discover that the systems they depend upon are subject to changes no amount of planning can fully anticipate. The final and most profound lesson that Tyche's mythology offers concerns the relationship between fortune and meaning. the question of how human beings can construct meaningful lives in a universe where chance plays an irreducible role. This question, addressed by ancient Greek philosophers through centuries of reflection, remains one of the most fundamental issues in contemporary philosophy, psychology, and spiritual practice. The ancient Greek response emphasized maintaining virtue and pursuing excellence regardless of external outcomes, recognizing that character and the integrity of one's efforts represented the only aspects of existence within individual control. The concept of eudaimonia reflected the understanding that genuine well-being required attention to both controllable and uncontrollable dimensions. The wise person cultivated virtue because it was intrinsically valuable, while acknowledging that external outcomes depended on factors exceeding personal agency. The stories of individuals who maintained dignity in the face of devastating reversals provided the most compelling illustrations. Croesus on his funeral pyre, finally understanding Solon's wisdom. Polycrates, recognizing the futility of appeasing fortune through voluntary sacrifice. These narratives served not merely as cautionary tales, but as positive models of how human beings could respond to fortune's challenges with philosophical maturity that transformed adversity into wisdom. Contemporary psychological research on resilience and post-traumatic growth has confirmed these ancient insights. Studies consistently show that individuals who experience significant adversity often develop greater psychological strength, deeper empathy, enhanced appreciation for life, and more meaningful relationships. The concept of post-traumatic growth represents scientific validation of the ancient insight that fortune's reversals could produce wisdom exceeding what comfortable circumstances could generate. The institutional dimensions retain relevance as well. The concept of organizational resilience reflects the ancient understanding that communities needed moral and institutional flexibility to respond to fortune's reversals. Communities that concentrated resources in single industries or maintained rigid structures proved consistently vulnerable to catastrophic reversals. Those that maintained diversity, flexibility, and capacity for rapid adaptation demonstrated the practical wisdom that Tyche's worship cultivated. The ancient Greek practice of maintaining diverse economic activities, multiple diplomatic relationships, and flexible political institutions represented practical applications of theological insights that contemporary organizations would do well to emulate. The wisdom encoded in Tyche's mythology was never merely theoretical, but always oriented toward practical strategies for surviving and thriving in a world where outcomes could not be guaranteed. The ultimate message, distilled from centuries of accumulated wisdom expressed through countless narratives of rise and fall, concerns the fundamental nature of human existence in a universe that combines order and chaos in proportions permanently exceeding mortal comprehension. Tyche was not merely a theological construct, but a profound recognition of irreducible complexity that no amount of knowledge or technology could eliminate. And so the wheel turns, as it has always turned, as it will always turn. The cornucopia overflows with gifts that may prove to be curses. The rudder steers toward destinations no mortal can predict, and the goddess watches with ancient eyes that have witnessed every human attempt to transcend mortality's limitations, and every demonstration that such transcendence remains forever beyond reach. But here is the secret that Tyche whispers to those who listen carefully enough. The secret that separates the wise from the merely clever, the resilient from the merely stubborn, the truly fortunate from the merely lucky. It was never about stopping the wheel. It was never about predicting where it would carry you. It was always, only, about who you choose to become while it turns. The merchant who shares his wealth before fortune demands it back. the king who remembers Solon's words before the pyre is lit, the philosopher who laughs when he falls into the well, then climbs out and keeps looking at the stars. That is Tyche's final gift, not the gold, or the glory, or the power that she distributes and reclaims with equal indifference, but the knowledge that the only fortune that cannot be taken from you is the fortune you carry within. The wheel turns. It will always turn. And the only question that has ever mattered, from the first Greek sailor who whispered her name into a storm to you, listening to these words right now, is not what fortune will bring you tomorrow, but what you will bring to fortune. The wheel turns. Ride it well.